Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to 2024 CCOVI lecture series. The note says I'm Malki Spodek entomologist, but I'm not. I'm Sid Pujari. I'm a virologist, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Kelly. Jennifer is currently the scientist in enology at CCOVI and an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Biological Sciences here at Brock University. Jen completed her PhD in 2019 here at Brock University under the supervision of Dr. Debbie Mills and Dr. Gary Pickering, working with the industry on a relatively new wine style for the region, appassimento wines, which are the wines made from dehydrated grapes. During this time, she developed her skill set in flavor analysis, sensory and consumer science, as well as working with locally isolated, non-traditional yeast for wine fermentation. She continued in CCOVI as a postdoctoral fellow under Debbie and joined CCOVI in 2023 as a research enologist. Jennifer now works directly with industry on priority issues, drawing on her experience in practical winemaking from her time in commercial wineries here in Ontario, as well as Barossa Valley in South Australia. I don't know if you went to South Australia, as well as her research expertise. She also a member of Winter's Quality Alliance, Standards Development Committee, and the CCOVI Outreach Committee. Currently, she is developing her research program focused on industry-directed mitigation strategies for a changing climate, understanding green technologies in wine production, consumer behavior, and uptake of new varieties suited to our climate. Today, she will be speaking to us about the sensory research she completed last summer to determine the impact of various enological treatments on tannin balance in red wines. So with that, Jennifer, it's all.
Thank you so much, Sid. And thank you, everybody, for joining me today. As you know, my name is Jennifer Kelly, and this is my first CCOVI lecture series, so it's a real pleasure to be here. Today I'm going to talk to you about some sensory work that we did with respect to Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon wines that were made here at Brock University with respect to the winemaking techniques that were implemented to manage the tannin profile. For my outline, I'm going to start by giving an overview of cool climate winemaking here in Ontario and look at tannins and their role that they play in grape skins and seeds. I'd like to discuss what tannins contribute to wine flavor, and then briefly overview the Tannin Alert database, which I know a lot of us are familiar with here at CCOVI and online. I'd like to review some data from 2019 and 2020 on wines that were made with Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon, and then review the sensory data that was conducted on those wines. And I'll finish with some concluding statements. So as you know, we're making wine here in Ontario in a cool climate. And we have the climate that can support a number of different varieties, both of hybrid type and French varieties known as vitis vinifera. However, there are many challenges associated with the variation that we experience from vintage to vintage. And I'm sure if anybody has ever spoken with a winemaker, they can always recall the specific challenges of any given vintage in our history of winemaking. With that, winemakers and grape growers are constantly adapting to a number of unpredictable and extreme weather events. Now, this may include increased precipitation during ripening, which may result in some unfavorable rot formation or perhaps some disease in the vineyard, and increased precipitation during harvest, which can make the harvest itself quite challenging. We're seeing warmer than normal winters occurring more and more rapidly, kind of deviating us a bit from the norm and what we're used to. Generally, we see a cool climate, and kind of within that umbrella, we seem to just be shifting a little bit. Our vines are also susceptible to winter damage with the occurrence of sometimes early spring frosts. So there are many things that are weather related that we have to constantly adapt to. We certainly see varying ripening capacity, and that is based on a number of factors, including the varieties of grapes that we grow here, along with the sites, as we have many microclimates within our region. So we are faced with some challenges, and one of those is certainly consistency. Our winemakers want to consistently produce red wines in particular of high quality despite this vintage to vintage variation. We want to retain our status as a leader in cool climate wine production, and we certainly want to appeal to consumers by producing wine and bringing wines to market that will be accepted by consumers. And we also have to take into account that there are sometimes changing trends in terms of consumption. With respect to important red wine quality markers, it's often that first interaction that the consumer has with the wine that are indicators of quality. So on first look, we're assessing the color. First taste, we're trying to assess whether or not the mouthfeel or the texture is giving us indicators of high quality. And as it turns out, a lot of these quality indicators are driven by tannin profile. When we're making wine, we want the right balance of both skin and seed tannins in the grapes at harvest. And with that, we understand how important the decision for harvest timing is. In our cool climate, we sometimes come up against barriers in achieving optimal ripeness. And ripeness, in this sense, can mean an umbrella of terms, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But generally, when we tend to see some cooler temperatures during the harvest period or during the ripening period, we may see a low accumulation of tannins in the grapes, which can result in wines that elicit this underripe sensation or underripe flavor and aroma, which is often an indicator of lower quality by the consumers. It's not me who said it, it's the consumers. So here at COVI, we always propose solutions to the challenges that our industry is faced with, and we work hard to design research projects around the challenges that serve our industry. We understand that winemakers may make stylistic considerations and adjustments in their processes year to year, and they make these decisions based on a number of factors. Certainly the varietal or the grape choice used for primary fermentation is of high importance when making winemaking decisions in the winery. We always have to consider the vintage decisions or the vintage conditions in order to understand the impact of the weather on the harvest that year. They also want to rely on the previous successes that their winery has had and respect the style preference of their consumer, of their brand, and also align themselves within the wine portfolio. So again, often harkening back to the importance of consistency in style. Now, in terms of assessing ripeness, we all know it's very common practice to assess Brix, which is the soluble solids of the grapes or the sugar accumulation of the grapes at the harvest time, the pH and the TA, which are indicators of the acid content in the grapes. And all of those working together can kind of give us a picture of whether or not the grapes are ripe. But another consideration that we can make is the tannin level. And this tannin level in the grapes that comes from the skin and from the seeds is really important for the bigger picture. And we'd like to help our industry include this in their consideration and make it part of their tool belt when they're working to make decisions in the winery to optimize practices for the best quality of wine. So what are tannins? I do apologize, I know this is a bit of a review, but I just wanted to outline the importance of the tannins in the skin and the seed that we find in our grape berries. I also wanted to acknowledge that tannins are also present in oak barrels, but in the case of this study, I'm just leaving that out of the conversation, as the wines that are made for research purposes did not see oak. So we recognize that there's tannins in oak, but I'm just focusing on the skin and seed content. So skin tannin, our most important and desirable of the group of tannins, is composed of monomers known as catechin, epicatechin, epigallocatechin, and these are kind of the building blocks of the tannins that tend to polymerize and make larger molecules, and as well as these larger molecules known as procyanidins. These molecules are responsible for color stabilization during winemaking and aging when they bind to anthocyanins. And those are the pigments that are found in the grape skins, really helping us with the color of the final wine. Now, these skin tannins are extracted early, usually within the first 2 to 3 days of fermentation. This is an important consideration for the extraction of these desirable tannins in the winery. And again, these are the most desirable for quality. Seed tannins, the lesser of the two, are also composed of monomers and polymers, but we see more monomers than polymers, and therefore we're seeing these smaller compounds. They are higher in the flavothriols, and if we were to look at the profile of skin tannin and seed tannin, we're more likely to see more epicatechin gallate. That's often an indicator of the tannin profile that we see in seed rather than skin. These seed tannins are responsible for the structure of the wine. They contribute to color stabilization and protection from oxidation. Generally, and overall, we see a much higher concentration of these seed tannins than we do of skin tannins, and that distribution varies amongst a number of factors, certainly variety being one of them. If we do see over-extraction of that seed tannin, it may result in some undesirable qualities in the wine. We may see high levels of that rough or drying tannin in the mouth, perhaps lower levels of color, and a lack of fruit flavor. And we all know these are kind of the first things that the consumer may indicate as a low or high quality wine. So we'd like to avoid the over-extraction of the seed tannin. There are many factors that influence the tannin levels that we find in the grapes. And as I was preparing for this talk, I just found that the list was a little bit endless. So this is not an exhaustive list, but I just want to introduce you to a couple of important considerations, certainly in the vineyard when it comes to the influence of tannin levels in the grapes. So grape maturity, obviously this is a very important component to understanding when our harvest timing is optimal. We want to see not only like aroma ripeness, we want to see phenolic ripeness, we want to see sugar ripeness, and we want to have them all in balance. When we see increased skin tannin concentration in the grapes, it could lead to higher tannin in wine. I know that's obvious, but it is a bit of a linear trend, and we certainly will see elevated concentrations in the grapes and less of that in the wine. So you really want to optimize how much you have in that skin because you lose a lot during the course of fermentation. Higher sugars, again, kind of one of the considerations of ripeness, and those subsequent higher ethanol levels can lead to an increase in tannin and color extraction. A lot of those compounds that are found in the seed tannin are extracted later in fermentation when there is the presence of ethanol. So the higher the ethanol, the more likely we have that extraction, and certainly we're seeing that in red wines, of course, because they interact with the skin and the seeds during the course of fermentation, and they also are in higher levels, and they start at higher sugar concentrations. In the vineyard, the canopy management of the grapevine has a major influence on the tannin levels. So the bunch exposure to light, which can be moderated through many factors, including like leaf pulling, leaf removal, perhaps your toasting type, can have an influence on how much tannin you're seeing in your grapes. The levels of irrigation selected in part of the vineyard management program can have an impact. The vine vigor will have an impact on tannin levels. And then the presence or absence of plant growth regulators like ABA can stimulate the production of skin tannin in grapes. So this was obviously one study that was done, but I thought that was a really interesting component of all of the things that can lead to this influence of tannin levels. So what do we care about tannins for? I'm always very interested in how we can apply this understanding to the sensorial impact of the wine. So this is well established that tannins have an impact on the astringency in the wine. Now this is a dry and puckering oral sensation that you'll experience in the mouth. I'm sure a lot of people have experienced that with perhaps tea, underripe bananas. I had one of those Sharon fruits one time that was underripe, and the tannins were unbelievable. So it's certainly a sensation, a tactile sensation in the mouth, and it's not a basic taste. Bitterness is a basic taste that can often be confused with astringency, and when we are conducting sensory studies with a trained panel, we work hard to ensure that they know the difference between astringency and bitterness because it's quite easily confused, and they often interact and occur at the same time. Those smaller tannin molecules that we find in the seed tannin are responsible mostly for the bitter compounds, and those larger polymerized compounds that we find in the skin are responsible for that lovely astringency. The other thing about tannins is that they change a lot over time in bottle. And when we see this polymerization, we are going to see changes in color. As you can see here, we have a younger wine that has certainly a lot more of that purple pigment, whereas here an older wine has a little bit more of that tawny and brownness. And that's going to impact the perception of astringency in the mouth with the impact of aging. So they're everywhere. They're doing a lot of things in the wine. Oops, sorry. Okay, so now that we have this real comprehensive understanding of what tannins can do, how they are moderated, and the impact that they have on wine, I wanted to introduce or reintroduce the Tannin Alert database. Now, this was a project that was born, I believe, in 2014 under the mind of Dr. Belinda Kemp and Dr. Debbie Ingalls. And they really wanted to provide a database for people in the industry so that they could better make use of the tannin, the extractable levels of tannin in the grape skins and seeds. So this Tannin Alert program, which ran over the course of a long time, reported tannin ripeness levels for 6 varieties over different sites in the Niagara region. So we're certainly seeing many different microclimates that are represented, focused on red varieties, and looking at 6 in total. The data collection officially started in 2015, and we have data in the database up to 2022, I believe. So it's quite a robust database. It's also updated in real time during pre-harvest monitoring, so that during the ripening stage of the grapes, growers and winemakers can have an understanding of how there is a temporal impact of the tannins during the ripening period. This database includes assessment of tannin in both the seed and the skin, because we understand that there is a different impact that each of them can have. And it's just an opportunity for gathering information in an Ontario database that winemakers and growers can use to gather just more data around ripeness and optimize those protocols. This is done with the goal of increasing Ontario wine quality, increasing our domestic wine sales, as well as market share. And I just have an image here of, this is part of the assessment of, or the analysis of the tannin assay, where we separate the skins and the seeds, and through this methylcellulose precipitation assay that has been developed through some partnerships with, or some understanding of what was being done in Australia, they have utilized this method to measure both in the skin and the seeds. So considering that the Tannin Alert database has been around for a long time, I just wanted to give some examples of what it has demonstrated over many years of data collection. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to mention that this database continues to grow. And it's one of the services offered by our Analytical Services Laboratory here at CCOVI, where growers and winemakers can submit samples of their grape and whatever variety that they're interested in, from whatever microclimate they're interested in, and then they can input that into the database so that the information continues to grow. We understand that there is a difference in the skin and seed tannin accumulation during ripening and up to harvest. And along with all of those differences that I mentioned in terms of the factors influencing tannin level, we also know that varieties have a big impact. The way that they accumulate is very different. There are differences amongst vintages, of course, as we expect, and there's differences amongst sites. So this is a highly variable part of ripeness. So I wanted to just include for you here a couple of examples of the ripening of skin and seed tannins. And because this is focused on both Cabernet Sauvignon and Pinot Noir, I just wanted to give a couple of examples of that. So I wanted to demonstrate here the vintage variation. As you know, this project is focused on wines that were made in 2019 and 2020. And we can see that this is the same grape, collected from the same site. The only difference is that it was done 1 year apart. So certainly the vintage has a large impact on that development of tannins in both the seed and the skin. And what we expect is that that extractable skin tannin will increase over time and the extractable seed tannin will decrease over time. And we kind of see that here. We certainly see it really nicely demonstrated in the 2020 data, a little bit different in 2019, which just highlights the importance of this annual data collection for us to better understand how these compounds are ripening within the skin and the seed. With respect to site differences, I wanted to highlight some data from the Pinot Noir trial that was collected in 2019. Here we have skin, here we have seed tannin, and as you can see, this was data collected over 4 sites. And although they're relatively trending in the same direction, there are certainly big differences among sites. So then you throw in the impact of vintage, you throw in the impact of variety. There's just endless combinations for which people can compare their values to. So how would a winemaker compare their skin and data to this database? Well, the way that it's arranged and presented to those who make use of the Tannin Alert database by logging into the online platform is that it's been distributed with the 33rd and 66th percentile in order to categorize the tannins into low, medium, or high categories. Okay, so it's like a real visual way to understand kind of where you stand. Now, the cool thing about this is that you can utilize the database to benchmark your varieties. So I have some updated data here that looks at skin and seed tannin ranges for all samples at harvest from 2015 to 2022, and it just gives us the full scale of the range for the Niagara region. And here we have that demonstrated through a histogram, but these are the values here. So this is really the culmination of every piece of data in the data set that allows us to understand the low lows and the high highs and how that data is distributed. Now, if you had one data point, say you were looking at your skin and seed tannin levels for 2019 Pinot Noir, for example, you could benchmark it against this and then have an understanding of where you fall with respect to the entire region. If you wanted to, you could benchmark it against that same variety from another vintage or perhaps another site. So there's many ways that we can utilize this database for us to gain an understanding of kind of where we fall within the trends of the region. So these histograms are, a visual representation of it. And generally, we're seeing higher concentrations in the in the seed than we are in the skin. So this is really cool, and this is what we've utilized moving forward in this project to benchmark the values that I'm going to share with you. So I'd now like to turn our attention to a project that's focused on grape varieties that fall within the low and high tannin varieties. So the selection of Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon for this study was selected intentionally to represent kind of both ends of that tannin spectrum. There were winemaking treatments that were implemented on these two varieties, and the idea was to understand if the treatments of, I'm going to list them all here, exogenous tannin addition, pre-fermentation pressing, Sanier, and enzyme addition, do they have an impact on the final tannin concentration or the extractable concentration of tannins in these varieties, and how are they impacted differently given that we're looking at both low and high tannin cultivars? Because this data was collected, the wines were made in 2019 and 2020, I'm sure you can imagine that there was a little bit of a disruption with respect to the timeline. So at the time, it wasn't possible to do sensorial evaluations of these wines. But I had the good fortune of being able to take these wines to participants in the summer, in August 2023, in the summer that just passed, and then we're able to ask the question, are there perceptible differences in the treatments? And how does that compare to the chemical data? So I'd like to just introduce you a bit to the winemaking, and then we can get into the sensorial impact of those treatments. So, as I said, there's so many different factors that impact the tannin profile, but with respect to these two varieties, we see that both of them have a higher concentration of their tannins in the seeds. In Pinot Noir, we're seeing it's approximately 80% of those total polyphenols being represented by the seeds, and 15 to 20% from the skins, whereas we have the opposite in Cabernet Sauvignon, 95% coming from the seeds and only 5% from the skins. But the difference is in the time of harvest, right? This is an earlier ripening variety. This is a later ripening variety. So with respect to Pinot Noir, there is a danger that wines could result in higher astringency because we're over-extracting the seed tannins, trying to extract as much of that skin tannin as possible, given that they are harvested early, they tend to have low color, and we're just trying to get all the color we can out of it, right? Whereas Cabernet Sauvignon, taken left on the vines a little bit longer, but in a cool climate, we might see that they are harvested a little bit early, perhaps resulting in some of that underripe accumulation of skin tannin and pigment accumulation. So same kind of idea, just presented in two different ways amongst these two varieties. So I'd like to start with the Pinot Noir winemaking experimental design. And the reason I've included the 2019 experimental design is that it really informed how the wines were made in 2020. And the 2020 wines were the ones that we brought to our panel in order to be sensorially evaluated. So in 2019, they made use of exogenous tannin addition, that was skin tannin, pectolytic enzymes, the Grand Cru enzyme, and then a combination of those two treatments. Those were compared back to a control that weren't manipulated in any way. Everything was fermented with EC1118, which is the Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast strain, often used for our research studies, in that it's relatively neutral in terms of the aromas that it presents, but it's also a bit of a workhorse, and we can count on it to ferment anything to dryness. And everything was done in triplicate. Once these wines were made and everything was analyzed, it was recognized that the addition of skin tannin didn't have a significant impact on the extractable tannin. So therefore, moving into 2020, they kind of dropped it from the list of treatments and included a different enzyme, this cellulosic enzyme, and then they combined both enzymes in the 2020 Pinot Noir winemaking. When we look at the skin and seed values in 2019 and 2020 for the site that these grapes were harvested from, I'm sharing with you here the at-harvest data points. And again, these have been benchmarked against those relatively new values that come from the Tannin Alert database, leaving us with an understanding that, we have medium levels of skin tannin and high levels of seed tannin. Well, when we look at what's more optimal, we're seeing that in 2020, this lower level of seed tannin or medium level of skin and seed tannin is more likely to produce a wine that may be a little bit less bitter. We're not extracting a lot of that seed because there's just lower concentration there in general. So the 2020 wines were really shaping up to be, an excellent profile at the beginning. So these wines were made, and the extractable tannin was measured when the wines were pressed. They were measured 3 months post-pressing and 9 months post-pressing. And what we can see here is that the control is certainly lower in extractable tannin values than we see the ones that have been treated with the enzyme. So certainly that addition of the enzyme overall for all treatments increased the concentration of extractable tannins. And we're also seeing that tannin retention is better with the enzyme addition versus the control. So kind of a twofold impact here, which is really interesting. And if I direct you to the combination of the two enzymes, we're seeing statistically that even after pressing, there's no statistical difference in the 9-month post-pressing extractable tannin level. So that was great. We're seeing high retention. Okay, I just have to pivot for a moment and give you a little bit of methodology on the sensory test that we did before I present to you the results, because I just wanted to explain what we did. So in order to assess whether or not there were differences amongst the treatments, we had to select the right test type. Now, there's many different tests that you can select for assessing differences amongst treatments, and in this case, we conducted a triangle test. These were conducted in August of 2023, and our participants were recruited from Brock University. I think we all know that it can be very challenging to recruit people in the summer, so my research assistant Daniel and I were so pleased that we were able to recruit 31 and 32 participants. We were really happy with that. I think a lot of the participants are here in the room right now. So the design that we custom made through the CompuSense online platform, which is a data collection sensory software system, was that everything was compared to everything. In order to do that, because we had 4 treatments, we had to have our participants receive 6 triads of wine. So essentially they would receive 3 wines at once, 2 of which were different, and no, 2 of which were the same and 1 was different. And the question was, tell us which one is different. And that's it. That's all we were asking them. We weren't asking them if they liked them, if they could, provide a hedonistic evaluation of it. We were just asking if they were different. And we instructed our participants to smell and taste the wines, of course, also expectorate them, and then decide which one was different, without a lot of further instruction. Just taste as you would. So here we have the results of the difference test for Pinot Noir, and I just want to go through how this is arranged here. So we had our 6 triads of wine, and this illustrates what was compared to what. So in the case of the control being compared to T1, which was the wine that was made with the addition of the Grand Cru enzyme, we see that 19 out of 31 of our participants were able to correctly identify the odd one out. So that was great. And the way that we can assess whether or not these values are of statistical significance is by comparing them to a critical table. This is done from one of our classic sensory textbooks. And here, you know, at 5% statistical significance level, meaning that there's only a 5% chance that this happened by chance, we have to have 16 correct respondents. At 1%, 18, and at 0.1%, 20. So when it comes to the Pinot Noir, we saw relatively high agreement amongst our participants in being able to differentiate what was what. So that was exciting, and as you can see here, these two triads, there wasn't enough agreement amongst the panelists. Certainly, you could strengthen your numbers by, you know, increasing the number of participants, but our goal, a strong participant number for this kind of test is 30, so we were really pleased that we were able to reach that. I also was able to utilize the CompuSense online platform and provide an open-ended opportunity for participants to include some descriptors around the wines. Now, sometimes in these kind of tests, you can include a predetermined list of descriptors, but because we hadn't trained anybody and we had a lot of people coming in, we just left it open-ended so that people could type in some of the words that they thought were associated to the wines that they were tasting. Through the CompuSense program, you're able to sort those words, and then they will provide a frequency at which they appear to each wine, which I thought was a really cool technique. I had never done this before with CompuSense, and I feel like their software is really great. I was really happy with that. So I selected words that were tannin related. They provide everything that people have indicated. Some of them may be, you know, chemical, for example, or strawberry, but I just looked at the ones that were related to tannin-related descriptors. So words like drier, grippy, tannic, tannin, bitterness, mouthfeel, astringency, and bitters were the ones that I pulled that seemed to be the most related to tannin. Now, in terms of the frequency, we're seeing here that the control and the T1 are tied in the number of times that some of these numbers may, or these words may have come up. But I'd like us to all remember that these are red wines that do contain tannin. So the control would certainly be you know, there is tannin present in the perception of these wines, and so that would probably explain why they occur here in this category. But aside from the control, we're seeing that those that have the Grand Cru addition and then the Grand Cru plus the dark berry had a higher frequency of these tannin-related words. So I thought that was interesting. Some sensorial takeaways. I just wanted to kind of summarize everything here. And we see generally that panelists were correct more often, spoiler alert, when compared to the Cabernet Sauvignon trial, okay? So there were more agreement amongst the panelists in terms of finding which one was different. They were able to more easily discern differences between wines, and that was more pronounced when the treatments were compared to the control. We see that the treatment 2, which is the dark berry addition to T3, the combination of the enzyme additions was also significantly different, and these were the ones that the panelists were unable to differentiate from, those two triads that didn't quite make the cut in terms of significance. This was aligned with the extractable tannin data, so that was exciting for us. You know, we have some alignment with the chemical data. It helps to understand perhaps why these results came to be. And a hypothesis around why this is happening is that perhaps these low tannin varieties are more susceptible to the perception of the levels of extractable tannin. So I think that because Pinot Noir in general is a lower tannin variety, any manipulation in that tannin just might be easier to perceive. I know that some people who were in the study said that it was really difficult to differentiate amongst them, but we had success in that. So I thought that although subtle, because they were generally lower tannin varieties, it might have been easier for everybody to pick up on them. So I'd like to go through the same experimental design that we saw for Pinot Noir in the Cabernet Sauvignon, given that there was different tannin management strategies applied to the Cabernet Sauvignon wines. So certainly the selection based on the 2019 data was to include some pre-fermentation pressing, saignée, which is the exclusion of some runoff juice, to increase the interaction between the grape skins and seeds and that must. We're just increasing that ratio because we're letting some of that juice run off. And that's just one of the tool belts, the tools in the tool belt that winemakers can use to extract more tannins. But again, upon reviewing the results, they saw that the pre-fermentation pressing did not have significant impact on the extractable tannin levels. So that informed how the wines were made in 2020, where there was the inclusion of the enzymes along with that saignée that did tend to have an impact on extractable tannin levels. So when we look at the skin and seed levels and harvest for 2019 and 2020 for the same site, for the same grape variety, we don't see the variability that we did in the Pinot Noir levels. So we're seeing that we have medium skin and high seed levels in both vintages. So that was kind of an interesting finding. Again, so much variability amongst variety and site, and here we're having some cohesion amongst these 2 years. We have the same kind of data where the wines were measured for extractable tannin concentrations with the control at 3 months and 6 months post-pressing. I understand there was a COVID disruption, and that's why there was a 6 month, or there was not a 9 month tannin measurement just because of COVID, because it was 2020 and that's what happens, right? So as we can see here, the combination of saignée and dark berry enzyme had a higher extractable tannin level, and that our tannin retention is better with the saignée and the enzyme. And I think overall, this combination here of both of them seemed to result in higher levels and better retention. So interesting results with respect to how these treatments can be implemented and what they do in respect to the wines. Now, here are the results of the difference tests for Cabernet Sauvignon, again, arranged in the same way, where we have the triads here, how the treatments are compared to each other within those triads, and the results. And what you'll notice is that it's a lot different than the Pinot Noir. We actually have kind of an even split amongst our participants for these here, and then, not as great agreement amongst our participants for the Cabernet Sauvignon. So again, interesting results that we found, just preliminary sensorial results from this difference test. Again, we had the opportunity to provide open-ended descriptor places, and those tannin-related words I was able to take from here. And they were a little bit different. This one was more tannin, much bitter, bitterness levels, astringency, mouthfeel, sharp, bitter, dry and prickly, and chewy. Chewy is my favorite. And we can see here that there is a different distribution of how those words were utilized for these treatments, with the T2 dark berry having the highest number of frequency. And overall, we just see a higher number of these tannin-related words in the Cabernet Sauvignon. So I thought that was an interesting finding as well. With respect to some sensorial takeaways, we see that, again, the panelists were correct less often when compared to Pinot Noir data. They were unable to detect differences in the saignée method from the control unless there was that enzyme added. So the enzyme addition really had a perceptible impact on the wines. And again, this was aligned with the extractable tannin data. This even split amongst the panelists was interesting. It just kind of made us realize that it was more difficult for the panelists to identify those differences. We also see a higher number of words associated with tannin-related language when we compare it to the Pinot Noir data. And perhaps in this case, the higher tannin varieties may be less perceptibly impacted by the addition of enzyme, because those control wines are already higher in that perceptible tannin level. So it could just be that these wines are, less influenced by the impact. Because the difference test often represents preliminary sensory findings, and you can use that data to go further with your sensorial analysis, whether you do descriptive analysis or consumer preference, to better understand how these wines are perceived by your tasters. I just wanted to share with you some other sensory findings from another research group who looked at hedonistic assessment of wines with tannin addition. Now, they were considering appearance, aroma and bouquet, taste and texture, aftertaste, and overall impression. And I think these are important considerations for the addition of exogenous tannin, because you never know how it could affect all of those, especially color, especially aftertaste, right? You don't want it to result in a bitter wine or... So they did a different mixture of tannins, and the authors report that the highest rated preference sensory results were with a tannin mixture that was a 1-to-1 ratio of hydrolyzable and condensed tannins. So, you know, the addition of exogenous tannins can result in favorable sensorial impacts. And I think that's important to understand that, like, even though you're doing manipulations, whether it be low or high tannin varieties, it's not going to negatively impact your wine. And taking this further into, you know, we can make assumptions with hedonic assessment, but we can actually assess the consumer preference amongst the different additions. So I think that could be a direction of future research. Spider plots, my favorite thing. So I wanted to show you that this was a study that was done in 2016 with the effects of pre-fermentative addition of enological tannins on wine components and sensory qualities of red wine. And what they did is they looked at 3 different tannin types and added them at different rates. And I just wanted to demonstrate to you what kinds of descriptors may come out of these kinds of studies, where we're looking at the addition of tannins at pre-fermentation levels or pre-fermentation timeframes, and you may see that that will have an impact on, you know, astringency and body, maybe fruitiness, aroma quality, color intensity. All of these are impacted by the addition of exogenous tannin at different rates. So I think these studies are important because they allow us to understand, you know, what kind of sensorial impact we will have. Certainly you can always run a bench trial, but it's nice to have a big number of people tell you whether or not they agree, right? So the last thing I wanted to share with you was just some techniques for managing tannin in the winery. And again, this is another one of this not exhaustive list, but I just wanted to share with you some of the things that are already in existence. These are tools that are available to winemakers that they may make use of when they want to extract perhaps more or less tannin in their wine. So enzyme addition, we know that certainly works to increase the amount of tannin in finished wine, as well as extended maceration. Just that length of time where we're having interaction between the must and the skins and seeds is obviously going to extract more of that into the wine itself. Cold soaking crushed must is another technique that's been implemented, but this is not consistent across grape varieties. So again, another factor that could have an influence on the extractable tannin in the wine. Cap management. This is really, really important to your tannin extraction in the wines. And we see through some studies that submerged cap extracts more tannins than punch downs do. And I think that is like a logical conclusion that we can draw, that there's just more time and contact is going to result in more extraction, whereas the punch downs may happen less regularly. The temperature that is imposed during fermentation can have an impact on the tannin extraction. Certainly a higher temp is going to result in more. And this is directly related to the use of a technique called flash détente, which is when grapes are heated up pre-fermentation to a really high temperature. However, this tannin extraction that was like achieved through this is not stable after pressing. So it just really outlines the importance of the cap management with this. So I think of all of the factors that we can consider, cap management is really high up there. Oxygen management during fermentation is going to have an impact on your extractable tannin levels in the wine. And we know that saignée or juice runoff can certainly increase tannin just because of the change in that ratio. As always, we see that yeast selection, which has an influence on almost everything, can also have an impact on our final tannin concentration. So with respect to future directions of this type of work, it's very exciting that the Tannin Alert database will continue to grow to inform the industry, and it's available for those who would like to make use of it to benchmark their varieties against this historical database that we have developed here at COVI, which is really exciting. Perhaps further sensory evaluation based on that preliminary information that I provided to you today could lead us to a better understanding of the impact of the treatments on the wine. Again, a descriptive analysis would really allow us to compare these full profiles to one another, and then we can get data like the spider plots, for example, that we saw, where we could see, is there higher or lower intensity of some of those descriptors based on the use of those treatments. And consumer preference, I find, always helps us really inform the full impact of how those who consume the wine will perceive these treatments. So I just wanted to say some thank yous. I wanted to thank Charlene Marcotte very much for allowing me to use her data and to bring her wines to our panel. I know it was something that she really wanted to do as part of her work, but she unfortunately wasn't able to due to timing, so we were able to do that for her. I want to thank Daniel, who's here in the room today, for his help with the study. I also want to thank Dr. Belinda Kemp and Dr. Debbie Ingalls for allowing me to use this data and for coming up with this idea. I think it's really a fantastic addition to the tool belt that the winemakers have access to, and all of the panelists, especially in this room, who participated in the study. Over the course of the Tannin Alert project, there were many contributors in terms of funding and great donators, so I just wanted to acknowledge them and thank them for their contribution to this project. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you for your time.
Questions? Any online questions?
Were there any differences in the wine chemistry?
Good question. So these wines were made from the same batch of grapes, and those additions were made, and then the wine was made, and the chemical analysis was done. And the reason that I didn't include that data is that there was very little statistical significance with respect to differences in the wines from the treatments. So I think there was a little bit of difference in tartaric and lactic acid, but nothing that would have an impact on the sensorial perception. So really, because of that agreement or that lack of statistical significance, we were able to really focus on the treatments imposed on the wines and see how they had an impact on sensorial perception. Thank you. Yes?
I just wondered what your personal preference was with treatments for the Pinot Noir or Cabernet Sauvignon, and are you continuing with Tannin Alert research?
Yes, so thank you for the question. I really liked the double enzyme add for the Pinot Noir, I believe it was, the Grand Cru and the Dark Berry, and I think we all tasted them, and I thought that was a really nice way to kind of extract or enhance those tannins. With respect to the Tannin Alert research, this was based on, I believe, a 5-year research project that allowed the data to be collected. And now that Analytical Services is offering this as a service, the database will continue to grow. But with respect to research, we'll have to see if it's going to continue. But I think it's an excellent way for winemakers to understand the phenolic ripeness.
Any more questions? Greg? Okay, I have one question. I don't know much about the wine chemistry at all, but I heard that the alcohol levels influences the tannins in a much broader way than the rest of. Did you see any differences in your two varietal alcohol levels, how it is influenced with the tannins?
Alcohol levels?
Yeah.
Yes, interestingly, along with all of the wine chemistry, there was no difference in ethanol levels. And on top of it, they did a colorimetric analysis where they looked at the degree of pigment and compared the color, because that could certainly have a big impact on those wines. And they were not different either. However, just in case it was perceptible by eyesight, we made use of the red lights in the sensory analysis, just to be sure that there was no perceptible difference. Provided.
I'll have one more question just on the extraction of tannins, because I know you mentioned in one of your citations that they view is that concentration is higher in the points of fermentation, and traditionally pH will happen for happen more at that point in the management of red wines. Was the management of the red wines, the cap management of red wines, the same across all trial?
Ooh, that's a very good question. It's something I'd have to go back and look at. I have the citation up here, so I can share that with you. But yeah, from what I understand. Sorry?
I mean, notice.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, from what I understand, it's those the seed tannin that is extracted with the presence of ethanol. So yeah, we can look into that a little bit more.
Yeah, Tony.
Do we have any theories that why the recognition of the skin tannin didn't do anything to the wine?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I have Charlene's thesis available to us to look into that. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. It might have been the timing of the ad. Perhaps if you were to add it, like not pre-fermentation, but at different time frames, we may see differences. I do think that there are truly endless research opportunities for this kind of work. So it might have been a timing issue. Yeah.
On the topic of seed tannin, varying opinions around that. I just wanted to ask your opinion on seed tannins and their natural seed tannins, not added seed tannin, but their effects on wine.
Yeah, so
Some people say seed tannin is anything, but
is kind of what?
it's like a bit of a myth that doesn't affect the wine.
Oh, interesting.
But, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I do think it has an impact. I do think that the ripeness level is probably the bigger impact. Like, Belinda did a lot of work looking at like when the seeds kind of start to like lignify and go from green to brown. And I think that we're going to see a larger impact in that unripe phenolic characteristic when we just have generally underripe grapes. Whereas later, you know, it might have less of an effect.
Right, so that quality of seed as opposed to quantity. If you talk about quantity of seed, you start talking about like flesh, skin,
Yeah.
ratios as well, which always skew that kind of.
Yeah, certainly. And that would all change based on variety, based on site. Like, there's so many factors that can have an influence in.
But more than reason.
I think that would be the biggest consideration for that.
Right.
If no more questions, please join me in thanking Jennifer again for sharing her insight and expertise into managing the tannins. Thank you, Jen. So looking ahead to next week, we have a final lecture series of the 2024 lecture series. CCOVI researchers and assistant professor in biology, Dr. Jim Wilmot, will be presenting his research on understanding Vitis vinifera cold hardiness in Ontario after a decade of monitoring. So we look forward to you joining in person and online. We'll see you on April 10th. Thank you.